everyone, and welcome back to Public History with Jake and Justin. I'm Justin Boydoffer, joined by my co-host Jake Wynn. Today, we continue our exploration of public history with a deep dive into one of my favorite films, October Sky, a vivid portrayal of the space race's impact on a high school student from a small coal mining town in rural West Virginia. This film debuted in early 1999, making this year its 25th anniversary, which is crazy to me. It stars a 17-year-old emerging film star. You may have heard of him, named Jake Gyllenhaal, who plays the main character, Homer Hickam, a high school student in Coalwood, West Virginia, whose life is forever altered when he watches the Soviet satellite Sputnik guiding across the nighttime sky in October 1957. Like I said, it's one of my favorite films, and we considered it was a good fit here for the Public History of Jake and Justin podcast, considering we talk a lot about space and we talk a lot about West Virginia. So this is officially the formal podcast of the state of West Virginia and of the space race. But anyway, in this episode, we will discuss the history portrayed in the film, critical reaction to the film and its success at the box office, what the film says about the time period it was made, and our thoughts and reactions to the movie. So before we dive in, Jake, how you doing?
Doing well, Justin. Doing well, and very excited to talk about this movie. This is one of my all-time favorites. Just a great movie, and one that for me as a kid, from the moment I saw it became an instant classic, and I'm always excited to return to this one. So very excited to dive into this. It's been a crazy, busy, short holiday week. I feel like it should have been Friday, like 4 days ago, and excited for the weekend. But, this is a good way to end this week. So I'm excited to talk about this film. How about you? How are you doing?
I would concur with all of that. It's short weeks throw my whole time space continuum understanding of what's going on off. I thought it was Friday like 2 days ago, and then somehow today I thought it was Wednesday. So my days are all messed up. We're recording this on a Thursday for the audience's understanding of this. So I'm just all over the place this week. So also excited for the weekend.
Yeah, and this is I feel like just a perfect way to close out this week. So we're going to talk a lot about the 1999 movie October Sky today. We're going to talk, as Justin said, about some of the history in it, of this film, and really just talk about some of the feelings that this elicits in ourselves as well, and some of the history we see portrayed through this film. But before we get to that, I just want to walk through kind of like a little bit of like the Wikipedia, IMDb of this movie. I don't know about you, Justin, but like one of my favorite things to do with some of my favorite movies is just go back and review those Wikipedia articles, those IMDb pages, those old reviews, and really deep dive into the background of some of these films. Do you do the same thing?
I 100% do. As I watch the movie too, like I need to get better at it and put my phone down as I'm watching the movie, enjoy the movie, and then do it on the back end. But yes, I hadn't seen the movie in a while. So last night, my wife and I sat down, she had never seen it, which blew my mind. She's not the first person who I asked about this film today who had also never seen it. So please do yourself a favor and watch this movie. But yeah, as soon as it was over, started pulling up all the different Wikipedia articles about Homer Hickam, about the town, about the book that this is based off of called Rocket Boys, which is a pretty good book as well. So do the exact same thing as you, Jake.
Yep, I went ahead and purchased the audiobook, which I am now starting to listen to. But wisely, we are recording this after having seen the movie, but for me, not having yet read the memoir. So I know previously, before the podcast, doing this with, well, I guess even with the podcast, doing this with the film miniseries on HBO about the Second World War in the air, and Masters of the Air, and then also with Manhunt, I kind of ruined it for myself by reading the book like right before or during those series airing. So this time, watch the movie. Now going to go back and read the book. Yeah, it inspires me to go and kind of dig into this. So here's what I found with some very basic internet research. Some of this didn't even require some internet research, but who are the stars in this one? As Justin mentioned in the intro, we get a young teenage Jake Gyllenhaal playing the main character, Homer Hickam. This is Jake Gyllenhaal's first leading role in his budding film career. And he does by all accounts, a very, very good job in this film. We also get Chris Cooper uh, plays Homer Hickam's father in this film. I think does plays a great role in this as well. And then also a little bit less of a kind of a main character in this, but one who nonetheless um, plays an important role in the story, and that is Laura Dern playing Miss Riley, the teacher who inspires Homer Hickam and his friends. And so those are kind of the three notable actors that we see in this film. It is quite a bit of a large cast in this one as well, between Homer Hickam's friends, some of the characters who assist him, his mother, his brother. But those three I wanted to pull out because they are pretty notable actors. We also have this film being directed by Joe Johnston, who was a very big time film director in the 1990s. So the film before making October Sky was Jumanji. And then he's also going to make some bigger films later in the early 2000s, including a Jurassic Park movie, as well as a one of the Captain America films as well. A little bit of a synopsis of the film, just in case you haven't seen it. Spoiler alert, I guess, but if this movie is 25 years old at this point. This film tells the story of Homer Hickam, who grows up in a small mining town in southern West Virginia. He, in October 1957, watches Sputnik, the Soviet satellite, go across the sky. It inspires him. He's not very athletic. He is a good student by accounts in the film, but this inspires him to take up amateur rocketry. He and his friends start their own kind of rocket launching base just outside of their small town. They have to go off company property because they nearly blow up first Homer's house, and then the mine where his father works and is the superintendent of that mine that this town is built around. Through the film, we see Homer and his friends begin to understand the science of rocketry. They become very adept at this, going through a whole process that is very, very reminiscent of scenes in the film "The Right Stuff," which I thought this film does a great nod to that, with some music and seeing rocket after rocket after rocket explode on their launch pad. And we see ultimately the success of their rocketry skills as they begin to get a better grasp of rocketry. This is still in the 1950s. Rocketry itself is still at a fairly early stage. So as American rockets are blowing up in the effort to catch up to the Soviets, we see these kids having their own attempts at rocketry, being failures until they begin to better grasp the science of what they're trying to do, and we ultimately see them be successful. There's quite a few hiccups thrown at them, few issues. They get arrested for allegedly starting a forest fire in a nearby town, which then they subsequently, through the use of the science that they are learning, they are able to ultimately prove that they did not start that forest fire. They enter a national science fair, and ultimately these kids from this small town in rural West Virginia, where they have very little chance of getting out unless they play football, which is king in this part of West Virginia. They stand very little chance of going to college. The future for most of the young men growing up in this community is to go into the region's chief industry, into mining. These kids get out, and ultimately we see in this film that Homer Hickam is able to go on to pursue a career in NASA. And through the film, we see he also gains the respect of his father as well. And in the end, we learn the true story, a very basic, brief piece of the true story of all of these characters. How did this film do at the box office? It made $34 million worldwide against a budget of $25 million. And critically, it was pretty well acclaimed. So it today has 91% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. And at the time, I pulled out some reviews here, got generally very good reviews. This one is from the San Francisco Chronicle. Says, quote, while this movie hasn't many surprises, it does offer strong performances, especially from Gyllenhaal. We have another review here from 1999 from Rolling Stone. It says, quote, its prime virtue is in staying true to the small details. Corny? Sure, but you could do worse than throw it a salute. So those are some of the reviews, and now I'm going to turn it over to Justin. Throw a question at you here.
Boy.
Where did you first see this film?
Oh, Jake. It's hard for me to answer that. Growing up in West Virginia, this was our movie, right? Like I don't know if you had this where you grew up in Pennsylvania, or if anybody who is listening to this had the same thing, but you had substitute teacher day. They would wheel in the cart, they'd throw on a movie, and 9 times out of 10 for us, from when this movie came out in 1999, 2000, until really I graduated high school in 2012, October Sky was always the movie that was playing, and I had no issues with it. Love the movie, love everything about it. I think as a kid, I loved it even more just because I could. It's West Virginia, you know. I mean, how many movies are based in West Virginia? Not a lot, and usually not with. If they are based in West Virginia, they don't have the sunny, kind of feel good story at the end of it. So, I don't know. I can't remember the first time I saw it. I definitely know I was young, because I think we took like a school. We read the book Rocket Boys, and I think we took a school field trip and either saw it in a movie theater for like a special screening or saw it in the school or something like that. So, um, gosh, yeah, I will sing praises the entire time we talk about this, but this movie always just brings me joy watching it, just because I remind myself of me as a kid in elementary school watching the same movie, and then also kind of wanting to learn more about space and rocketry and all that kind of stuff. But then I became a history major, so I guess it failed in a way. But yeah, that's about me. That's for me. Do you recall the first time you saw it, Jake?
Yeah, I have a very distinct memory of the first time seeing this film, in part because it is paired with my first time ever visiting the nation's capital. So this is probably 2004 or early 2005. I can't recall exactly when this trip took place, but my family scheduled us for, I grew up in central Pennsylvania, about 45 minutes from Harrisburg, and my family booked a trip through the bus trip through the Harrisburg Area Community College, HAC, and it went to a couple of museums and memorials in DC and in Northern Virginia. So we went to the Udvar Hazy Center, so that we talked about last week in a
Yep.
previous podcast. So we went to the Air and Space Museum, Udvar Hazy Center. So we got to see all the spacecraft, aircraft there. We went into DC as well. We saw the World War II Memorial, which had just recently been opened. So we went to that. That was a big draw for us to go there. I remember having dinner in Georgetown as well, right on the Potomac River in Georgetown. And then on the bus ride home, we watched October Sky on the little TV on the bus.
That's awesome.
And I can remember driving by Frederick when we were on our return trip, and the movie's on, and we're rolling past Frederick, and that's my first memory of driving through Frederick on Route 15 and Route 270. So it's kind of like multifaceted memory of this trip. But I was like riveted. I mean, that was like the fastest bus trip home from DC, the fastest trip. It went so quickly, and I just remember the film just being amazing. And honestly, I did not see the movie again for probably 10 years after
Oh,
that.
Jake. Oh,
Yeah, did not have the same relationship with this film. It sounds like as you did. But every time I return to it since then, it always just it brings me joy to see it. And also, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. It does elicit a lot of responses from me, in similarities in my own life and experience and where I grew up, to the experiences that Homer goes through and where he grew up and the landscapes that he grew up in and the environment that he grew up in. So there's a lot of similarities there. I'll unpack that a little bit later, but I want to ask you, Justin, what you think about the film. I know you just said you watched it with your wife again, and what did you take away from this film this time you watched it, and
yeah.
overall, and all the times that you've watched it?
And I think it took me until this most recent watching to really hit home on this point, in that, like, for so many West Virginia families, you see your family in this. Um, at least for my personal experience, my grandfather um, was he worked in the mines. I mean, that's what he did. He a lot of the things, a lot of the experiences that Homer's dad or Homer goes through, that was my grandfather doing it a little bit after. He would have been in the 60s and 70s, and this is taking place in the mid to late 50s. Um, but it's just a reminder of just family dynamic in hard work. I mean, when you say blue collar, when you say going down there every single day, I think this film, and Jake, you can maybe you've seen something better, but this, at least to me, is one of the more vivid memories, or vivid kind of things I associate with mining, at least this type of coal mining on the big screen, right? Like, there's not a whole lot of big coal mining movies out there. Um, and this one, I think, does the most for that profession, showing the daily life, showing how hard it is, showing how dangerous it is, and then showing kind of the culture in these small little company mining towns that dotted the entire state of West Virginia into Tennessee, up into Pennsylvania too. That the entire focus of the town was based off of the mine and how it produced, and the town risen and fell based off of what the mine was doing. Some of these coal towns paid their employees in company script. I think my favorite detail about this movie, one of the many details about this movie, is Homer's mom's fascination with Myrtle Beach. And if you ever go to Myrtle Beach, I don't know what anybody else's experience with Myrtle Beach around the country. Myrtle Beach is West Virginia South. For, I don't know, I couldn't tell you how many West Virginia families, mine included, always vacation or always used to vacation at Myrtle Beach. And the story here is actually kind of fascinating, and I love that it's in the movie, that she talks about, painting her kitchen in as the beach. She wants to retire to Myrtle Beach. She ends up living in Myrtle Beach. Um, that love is created by these coal companies. So these coal companies, when they would give vacations to their employees, they wanted, in a way, the money to stay with the company. So they would give them vacations to property that the coal companies themselves owned in Myrtle Beach, which then set the standard for these West Virginia families for the last 50 to 60 years, always would take their summer vacation to Myrtle Beach. So I just think that that's one of those funny, small little details in this movie that just hits home for me, because I vacation to Myrtle Beach. That's where my family went. And it's from that kind of, now it's not because of it, like from that kind of mindset, word of mouth spreads. Hey, Myrtle Beach is great to go to. If you ever go to Myrtle Beach today, it's West Virginia South for that reason, which I just think is a great kind of little detail that, they don't explicitly say in the movie, but I smile every time I see her wall, or I smile when she says about it, because, man, I just see that in my family too. But going and looking at the movie nowadays, one thing that I did not pick up as a kid is unions do not get a good rap in this movie.
They do
I
not.
I was taken aback watching it nowadays. I was like, oh my gosh, this is, I don't know. I don't know about the director, don't know about like what they're trying to, I think it's more coming from Homer's dad's perspective of like, he's got to negotiate with the union for the survival of the town. The union wants one thing. He knows that if he gives that up or gives in to the union, the bottom line is cut, and in a way, the town might go away. So that was one, I think, striking thing that I didn't pick up as a kid, was the representation of how the union is viewed here in this movie. Um, I don't know. I'm sure there's an entire, podcast we could talk about unions in West Virginia and United Mine Workers and everything, but here in this movie, they kind of get a bad rap. And then finally, Sputnik changing U.S. thinking, right? I mean, I think this is kind of what I remember. If you told me before I watched it a couple of days ago with my wife, hey, what scene do you remember from this movie more so than anything else as a kid? I remember I remember Homer sitting underneath the train tracks with the rain, not knowing what to do with the girl. That's one thing I remember. And then number two is I remember the shot of Sputnik going through the sky in kind of a tracking shot of everybody looking up to it and kind of being scared and not knowing what's going on and not knowing what that satellite's doing because it's so new. And those are the two things that I kind of watched again. And I laugh about the train underneath the train tracks. I don't know why I remember that as a kid. But that tracking shot, I mean, it changed. It started the space race. I mean, you could say it was already started at that point, but it kicked it into overdrive, right? Eisenhower will say, we will never again be technologically surprised after Sputnik. And he throws a lot of money in NASA, creates a lot of new government agencies to make sure that that never happens again, that they're not beaten to the punch in a technological sense. And I think the end result, and this movie kind of takes a big jump at the end. You see him shoot off a bottle rocket. You see the rocket go up into the sky, and then snap, space shuttle up in the sky. And that connection is kind of the movie kind of forces you to make the connection. Well, there's a lot of things that went in between Homer shooting up a bottle rocket in southern West Virginia and the space shuttle going up into the air. You know, he ends up working more on the space shuttle program as an engineer in that latter part of the 20th century there. He's not really he's too young to be on the Saturn V kind of program and then kind of the Apollo programs to get people to space. Because, and I did not know this going into more research about it, he's actually in Vietnam for 5 years. Homer Hickam is honorably discharged from the United States Army after spending 5 years as an engineer officer in Vietnam, which is something until I literally sat down here and was reading this, or kind of prepping for this episode, I did not know. So that's kind of an interesting another backstory. And he goes to Virginia Tech. I'm always sad that he never went to West Virginia University, but he goes to Virginia Tech. He's a Hokie, and he is actually, more reading in behind the research of it, he actually helps create the cannon that the Virginia Tech Hokies fire off after, I think, every touchdown still to this day, or when they enter the stadium. I know Enter Sandman's playing. I'm not a Virginia Tech fan, but that's kind of cool that he goes to Virginia Tech, and also he's this rocket guy, but also is creating of the cannon that they use at Hokie games in Blacksburg. So yeah, that's kind of, it's a lot of what I think. Like I said, Jake, you did the wrong thing and just saying, what'd you think? And letting me go off, because man, I can riff about this movie forever. Because there are just so many different facets. And I think my favorite thing about it is you can kind of argue, is this a movie about space and engineering, or is this a movie about coal mining and labor? And I don't know. I mean, yes, it's about space, but you think about all the different things that go into making the rockets, making everything. And that's one thing that I loved. And I'll try to get off the line here. That way, get off my soapbox. But one thing I loved was that the entire town pitched in, and you see all of the different people who make up a coal town, all of the different minority groups who are, there for the job, sending money back home. I forget the name of the immigrant from Europe. He ends up, spoiler alert, he's the one who passes away in the movie, in the mine accident, talking about, I had to send this money back home to my family. They rely on whatever scrappets I can get because they're rebuilding from the war. And this is not 1957. So you could see kind of how World War II impacts Europe and impacts immigrants coming to the United States, trying to find work to help support their families back over there. So I'm going to take a breath now. I'm going to let Jake talk. Because, it's always a good idea to let Jake Wynn talk. So Jake, how do you feel about the movie?
Yeah, no, I think you touched on so many great points in this. And I thought especially poignant was your own kind of family connection to, this West Virginia story of mining. And this is one that, even though I did not grow up in West Virginia, I grew up in central Pennsylvania, kind of at the southwestern edge of the anthracite mining region. So different part of Pennsylvania, the eastern part as opposed to the western part of Pennsylvania that mines the same kind of coal as they do in West Virginia. This really resonated with me from the moment I saw this film back in 2004, 2005 to this time watching it in the lead up to recording this. And last year when I watched this film and showed it to my wife for the first time, this movie just, it really captures what it's like to grow up in a mining community. I grew up in one of these communities, a community that we see in this film. Coalwood is kind of on the edge of its destruction. The mine is giving out. We see the mine ownership having a conversation with Homer's father and telling them that this mine is dying.
Could I make the point here too? And even to the point where they talk about, and I think it's just a little one-off line, hey, they're from Toledo, they're from Ohio. The absentee mine ownership, right? These mines aren't owned by companies that are stationed in West Virginia. They're owned by corporations that are from Ohio, from Pennsylvania, from outside states, who are making these decisions for these citizens in here. So you brought it up, and that was just such a great little line that they threw in there that if you don't pay attention to it, you miss. But Yeah, it's just once again they didn't have to get that right, but they did.
Yeah, I think back, and I don't have the exact line from a book that I'm very fond of, which is about the Molly Maguires in Eastern Pennsylvania back in the 1800s. This is a group of Irish mine workers who were rebelling against mine ownership in the mid 19th century in Pennsylvania. And in the book, Mark Bullock talks about, he has a line in his introduction where he talks about the wealth of the mineral wealth of Pennsylvania flowing downstream of the Schuylkill River, and along the railroads to Philadelphia and thenceforth to New York and other cities on the eastern seaboard, and all of this wealth is flowing out, and very little of it is being invested in or returned to the people who are doing all of the work to extract and taking, facing the dangers that it took to extract this wealth from the ground and send it off to places hundreds, if not thousands, of miles away. It's just very, it resonates with me. And it comes through in this film as well. As you mentioned, Justin, that, we hear them talking about this, these absentee mine owners. That really struck me. I will say the other thing that struck me about this film from you know, just from watching it and the landscapes it portrays, the town it portrays, this to me, again, I grew up in Pennsylvania. It felt very similar. The idea of growing up in a narrow valley, the industry was built on mining. The ruins of the mining industry are all around you. I grew up exploring abandoned mines. This is in part what fascinated me and got me into the local history in Pennsylvania. And to see that portrayed in this film, exploring these old workings, these old abandoned rail lines, and then utilizing them as for recreation, and going out and exploring and walking. Um, the landscapes themselves in this film, showing the mountains, the trees, the forests, everything about this just felt very reminiscent of my own childhood, even though the mining industry by and large died by the time that I was growing up in the 1990s in my hometown. It just feels very, very nostalgic to me. It very much, I think, does a very good job. This film in general and the book it's based on does such a good job of showing what it's like to grow up in one of these towns where the mine is life. Everything revolves around the work underground. And I think the most striking scene to me, one that is true, I think, of every mining region, not just in West Virginia or Pennsylvania, but anywhere in the world, is the scene of the disaster, where Justin, you mentioned the immigrant miner. I believe his name is Ike Bukowski, where he dies in a mining disaster and mining accident, and Homer's father is severely injured as well. And the thump that everyone hears, that there's some kind of explosion or collapse, and then the alarm kind of going off, or the horn or whistle being blown, and everyone descends on the mine opening, in this case a shaft, and waiting for news, waiting for everyone to come out, and to see who's died, who's been injured. Everyone's waiting at the face, the mouth of the mine, and this is so reminiscent of it throughout history of what that experience would have been like growing up in one of these coal towns. The dread of what could happen, of waiting for the next accident, who has died, who's been injured. It's just they did such a good job with this film of portraying that dread, and then the consequences of what happens afterwards, of now Homer, a young kid, has to leave school to go and make enough money to keep his family going. And these are the realities that face. This is why, I think another thing that they show well in this film is just the the thought of, education is mandated in these in the United States, and and up to a certain level. And but the reality is that many of these kids growing up in these towns don't really have a future other than that tied back to the mine. And it's that mine is just all around these people. It is the lifeblood of these communities. The communities don't really have a purpose other than to supply labor, and supplies for the mine. And I just think that this film does such a good job of portraying that. Um, I will say too, the space piece of this film, the science piece of this film, I love when movies show a process of how a character learns something or puts pieces together. So Homer realizing and learning how to show that their rocket did not start a forest fire 3 miles away from their launch site is one of my favorite parts of the film, and the one that stuck with me most from watching it the first time back in 2004 or 2005, when they were able to prove scientifically that they could not have started that fire. And then that is what leads to them discovering that it's an aeronautical flare from the airport. It wasn't a rocket. And they basically are able to get themselves out of criminal prosecution for starting a fire that they had nothing to do with. I think that's stuck with me most, and probably the scenes that have stuck with me over the years watching this film, and I always go back to, and always think that the filmmakers did such a good job of portraying that.
Well, it's funny you say that too, because I always, when I think of the word nozzle, I say it in my head like they say it in the movie, which is a little southern, like West Virginia twang. And if you don't know where this takes part in West Virginia, if you picture the state of West Virginia, it is the very southern edge of it, in McDowell County, West Virginia, which is still one of the most poor counties in the entire country, due to what we see in the movie, the mine shutting down and there not being a lot of stuff there. So that area is actually still feeling the effects that you see in this movie. But yeah, I say nozzle. I just think of when they're machining the nozzle and it's coming through and he's explaining it. For whatever reason, every time I say the word nozzle, I think of that little scene.
Yeah, yeah, it's yeah. I always think it's so funny how I think it's Quentin, kind of the stereotypical nerd in this film, just he gets so excited about talking about hot gases being exhausted out of the nozzle. It's just cracks me up every time. Um, I do want to just make a couple points tied back to you, Justin, what you brought up about unions. Um, I have started Rocket Boys, the book that this movie is based on, and Homer Hickam talks about his father being uh, vehemently anti-union. He is the superintendent of this mine, and there's a line from early in the book that stuck with me from reading it earlier today, and that is essentially the thought that Homer's father was vehemently Republican, vehemently anti-union. He thought that FDR was the worst president ever. He thought his policies were all bordering on communism, but he thought that Lucifer himself was John Lewis, who was the leader of the United Mine Workers of America in this. And I just thought that was very funny to me. So that gets, I think, a little bit of a reason why we see the Union portrayed the way that it is in this film. It's getting distilled through Homer's eyes, but it's really his father's view of the Union, and what Homer's growing up with in the home of hearing about the Union and what the UMWA stood for. So it's being taken through that lens. I do think it's funny to think, because what ends the strike in the film that is kind of towards the end, is Homer's father, in order to get Homer the part that was stolen at the science fair in Indiana. He needs to get everybody back working, so the strike ends so they can make Homer the part that he needs to win the science fair. Conspiracy theory: it is Union instigators going to Indianapolis, stealing the piece to end the strike in Coalwood, West Virginia. I think we don't know.
We need to look into that. Unconfirmed.
We
Unconfirmed reports.
Some further investigation. I did think about that this time watching the film. I was like, we never learned who stole the pieces at the science fair. It was the United Mine Workers of America. And some other things too. Is this a space movie or a labor movie? I think this is a space film set in a mining town in West Virginia. It has to do both of those things. I think it is both a movie about working and growing up in a coal town, It is also a movie about how people get interested in space, in science. I think it's also a movie about education and the value of education. We see that with the character. We haven't talked a lot about her, but the character that makes me cry most in this film, not afraid to admit that, Miss Riley, who dies as a result of cancer in this film. I think that it's telling a lot of stories. This movie does a great job of telling the story about what it's like to grow up in the 1950s in an age of change. It is a movie about space, about science. It's a movie about mining, about what it's like to grow up in one of these towns. And it does a good job of telling all of those stories. So I think it is a film that does a great job of doing multiple things at the same time. And as that review that I read a little bit earlier from Rolling Stone says, that it is a prime virtue, and its prime virtue is in staying true to the small details, which throughout this film it does a very good job of staying true to the story it's trying to tell. So those are my thoughts. I think as we move on to our next segment here, I do want to talk a little bit more about how this film holds up over time. But before we get to that, is there anything you want to discuss before that, Justin? Or are you ready to dive into the next section?
Um, no, I think we covered really everything. I think how does the film hold up over time is a great question because it has been a minute since I had seen the movie. Unknowingly, I was able to come at it again with some fresh eyes. I just hadn't seen it in a decent amount of time. Um, and for me, I mean, it held up. Everything you just said about there's so many different there are so many different ways that you could look at this movie, and there's so many different storylines. And I don't think a single one of those storylines feel like yoky or rushed or like they all are the appropriate amount. They don't rush a whole lot of them. Maybe they rush the rocket at the end, like I said, going from, the bottle rocket into the space shuttle. But they just interweave so well that I think it holds up. I mean, personally, I think it holds up. And also it's crazy what 1999. That's 25, like you said, 25 years. The movie looks like it's 25 years old, which isn't a bad thing. I kind of it looks it all the different scenes, all the different shots. Um, I don't know. I thought it held up. I guess I said a lot without saying a little there. I think it holds up. I think it does a really good job. And I think that it weaves all of these different narratives, and Jake and I could pull at any one of these and start unraveling the yarn about labor, about the United Mine Workers, about rockets, about Sputnik, about we haven't even talked about Werner von Braun. We'll leave that for another episode because there's a whole thing we could talk about with him, and how he kind of and how they. I'll just leave that kind of yarn there for us to pull at a different date. But yeah, this movie allows you to do so much, and I think that's why I love it.
Yeah, yeah. It does. It holds up to me. To me, it's funny you said it looks like it's from 1999. I don't know if it's just my view of the kind of little bit of nostalgia tinge to this film. When I go back and watch it even today, to me it doesn't feel like it's that old. I think when you look at the actors and just how young like Jake Gyllenhaal is, yes, but I think there's a timeless quality to the film. I think in that they do such a good job of portraying it as being in the 1950s. I think between the music, the clothes, the cultural references that they're making, I think that they do a good job of really basing it in that era, and so in a way, it has a little bit of timelessness to it. There is also, I will say too, the and my mind has just gone blank as to what other point I was going to make. It may or may not come back to me.
That's why this podcast is great. We forget things all the time.
We forget things all the time.
Well, and I guess maybe there's one more point I want to bring up. One more thing doing research in this movie that I thought was just super fascinating. And maybe this will jog your memory as I'm sitting here talking about it. Is you go on Wikipedia, you look at the different things, and there's an article, and it mentioned it in the article, the Wikipedia article. But then I clicked on the link too, that in a way, this movie is responsible for Jeff Bezos creating Blue Origin. Because according to an interview that I think Bezos gave, he saw a screening of it in 1999 and had a conversation with a science fiction writer, whose name was Neil Stevenson. I don't know who Neil Stevenson is, but that made a point to say he's, a famous science fiction writer. And Bezos basically said that he always wanted to start a space company. So he creates what is now Blue Origin, and he's sending people up into space too. So part of me hopes in a way that Bezos, every time he sees one of his rockets go up, thinks about October Sky, Homer Hickam in West Virginia, because I would love that there's always a West Virginia connection somewhere. That without this movie, we may not have Blue Origin, or at least the private space company that Jeff Bezos founded, because I don't know. I thought that was an interesting thread. I don't know if I buy into it too much, but it's too good not to believe. I'm going to just put on my irrational historian hat here and say, nope, yep, it's only because of this movie we have Blue Origin. So yeah, that was just one of the thought I thought that as I was doing research before we transitioned to the postscript, that I wanted to kind of highlight, and that it has kind of other people view it the same way we do, Jake, and like inspiring us to kind of do and look in different things. So yeah, before we transition to the postscript, is your thought back? Could you remember what you wanted to say?
It is very fluid at the moment. It's coming in and out, but I will say, going back to how I think this era is portrayed. I think they do something interesting with this, and I see you have here in the show notes, you make a note of this as well. Um, is that the showing of the West Virginia mining towns as being pretty diverse in terms of like immigrant groups and people of color. And I do think that something that is interesting early in the stages of reading the book that movie is based on. Something we see, and I'm blanking on is it Leon, the African American metal worker who
Yeah.
is assisting Homer and his friends making the nozzles for them for their rockets. Who mentions that he's in the Tuskegee Airmen and he serves the Red Tails. Something interesting, there are African Americans in this community, but they are, as Homer Hickam describes in his book, we don't see this portrayed at all in the movie. But the community that they lived in, it's kind of a village on the outskirts of Coalwood. The name of the village is escaping me at the moment, but it was a segregated village on the outskirts of the main part of Coalwood, where the Black community in this area predominantly lived in, with the Black church. I do think it is interesting that there is a portrayal of this community as being kind of very very diverse, and everyone's kind of living together we don't see any of these kind of social divides that did exist, other than through the lens of the union versus non-union. So I do think that that's something that would be different if this film is made today. That would be a little bit more explored, whereas we see kind of that everything is hunky-dory in this part of West Virginia and in America at this era, where in fact in the late 1950s there is a lot of racial tension that runs through not only the Deep South, but through Appalachia as well. I think that would probably be more explored if this film was remade today. And I think I did have that main thought. The thought that I had has come back through me talking this out a little bit, and that is that this film, I think, does a very good job of staying very closely tied to its story. It knows the story it's trying to tell. It doesn't wander off. We see the focus being very narrow on Homer and his experience, and I think that is mainly why this film holds up so well. It sticks to those details. It tells those details well. And it doesn't go off in any tangents and trying to show anything about Sputnik other than what Homer understands about Sputnik and what the people of Coalwood, West Virginia understand about Sputnik and what they think about Sputnik and the era in which they live. And I think the film benefits from that very, very narrow micro focus. And I think more films about historic eras would be better served in the 21st century, in our own era, to take a page out of this movie's book and tell that very narrow focus and keep a narrow view to better understand how people lived through these very interesting times, sometimes difficult times in our history. So that's the thought that was in my brain earlier and escaped, and now it has come back. And I think, if you're okay with it, Justin, we can transition to our postscript now. You okay with that?
Well, once again, if we continue, I'd spend the next 5 years talking about this movie. So yeah, it's better for us to get the postscript. We'll save it for another episode.
Yes, so it is time for our postscript. This is the section of the show where we share something from the last week that's left an impression on us that we want to share with you, our listeners, and something so that we can preserve it for ourselves as well. This could be a book, an article, a movie, an experience. It's something that we want to kind of hold on to. So with that, Justin, what is your postscript this week?
Well, lucky for me, I get to go first because we see the show notes that Jake and I make, and we're actually going to talk about the same thing, which is fantastic. And that is the quote unquote double attempt this weekend. So for those who don't know, the NASCAR season and the IndyCar season kind of overlap, or they overlap. They're a good chunk of the calendar. And the Indy 500, the Indianapolis 500, is arguably one of the most famous sporting events in the world. I think it's the highest attended in-person motor sport event in the world. I think over 300,000 people, and I can't think of a whole other thing, anything else really that many people could fit into one location to watch one event.
Yeah, I don't even think it's just motor racing. I think it is just sporting
event. Yeah, I think as I said that, I realized that there's no stadium that could hold any more than that. So the Indianapolis 500 was this past Sunday. It is over Memorial Day, and it correlates with a NASCAR race called the Coca-Cola 600, which is at Charlotte Motor Speedway. It is the longest NASCAR race on the calendar, so they go 600 miles. So you have the Indianapolis 500, which is 500 miles. Then you have the Coca-Cola 600, which is 600 miles. And very few drivers, and I think only 4, if I have my numbers correct, have ever attempted to race in both. It is very different vehicles, the very different sport. Everything about the sport is kind of different except for the fact that they're on 4 wheels and they go around in a track. And there's a driver named Kyle Larson who is arguably one of the most talented racing car drivers on the planet. And I'm putting him up there with, if you're an F1 fan or anything else, he would be able to go toe-to-toe, I think, with anybody in the world. Kyle attempted to race in both of them, which, like I said, only 4 people have ever done it. There was a lot of buildup and anticipation for him doing it because of how successful he was in qualifying for both. He had to qualify both at his and I should say he's a normal NASCAR driver who was trying to jump over to IndyCar. He qualified 5th in IndyCar out of, and Jake, you might know this, is it 30 cars? Do I have that number correct? I forget how many cars there are in IndyCar.
They have 33 cars
33.
in the Indy 500.
Yeah, I know it was in increments of 3 because of how they started, but I couldn't remember. So he qualified 5th, which is better than people whose full-time jobs that is. So there is hope and anticipation that he might be able to, arguably, the ideal sense would have been to win one. I don't think anybody expected him to win both. Maybe somebody did, but to either win one or be up in the running and be very close. And the goal was for him to finish the Indianapolis 500, jump on a helicopter, jump to a plane, fly to Charlotte, North Carolina, jump on another helicopter, go back down to fly to the track in Charlotte, jump in his NASCAR, and then complete the Coca-Cola 600. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see it due to rain. There was a delay in Indianapolis that pushed the race back 4 hours, and then there was also a delay in Charlotte later on. So because of the 2 delays, he was able to start and finish the Indianapolis 500. He was not able to start the Coca-Cola 600. And then when he got there, he still tried to race in the Coca-Cola 600 because they were in a rain delay. NASCAR basically just stopped the race due to the rain. So with that, I thought it was fascinating because he's a very talented guy. That is something that is very, 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 I can't emphasize enough how hard that is to do. And he was very close to being the person who did both. He finished, I think, in the teens. I want to say 14th. He kind of messed up during the Indianapolis 500 because he was a rookie. That was the first time he ever ran in it. He ended up getting a speeding penalty, which took him out of the running for winning the race. But it was still just a fascinating thing. And I think over 4.3 or 5 million people ended up watching the Indianapolis 500, which is a huge number of folks. So I don't know. It's just it was a great weekend. Memorial Day is one of my favorite days out of the favorite holidays out of the year, both the memory of and importance of, but then also activities during, cookouts and watching motor racing and watching different things going on. It was a great Sunday for that, and not losing sight of why we have Memorial Day in the first place. But I don't know, it was just a great kind of weekend for sporting spectacle, I guess. So I will pass it to Jake. I hope I didn't steal his thunder. I don't think I did, because he's got something else to talk about with the Indianapolis 500.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is, I think they call it the greatest spectacle in racing. It is just an amazing event, a Memorial Day tradition. It's a bucket list item for me, to get there, to see the Indy 500 in person. I've got a few bucket list items in racing, able to accomplish one of them last year, see the Daytona 500 in Florida in February of 2023, which is an amazing experience. Indy 500 is next up on the list, of bucket list items. But I will say this year's race, was one for the ages. A racer slash podcaster that I listen to, Parker Kligerman, has a great podcast out there about racing in all forms, not just NASCAR or IndyCar or F1. They talk about it all. He called it one of the best races, not just IndyCar, but races in general, of the last decade. And it was an amazing show to see, to see this race, to see Joseph Newgarden, Penske racer, win his second in a row over Pato O'Ward. I was pulling for Pato, for McLaren, Arrow McLaren, who finished in second. Just an amazing race, an amazing tradition, and one Memorial Day tradition that, like Justin said about traditions, this is one for me. It's watching the Indy 500 is synonymous with Memorial Day. It has been for most of my life growing up. Same with then closing out the evening with watching the Coca-Cola 600 in NASCAR. So yeah, we are big time racing fans on this podcast. This won't be the last time you'll hear about us talking about some racing things.
Just wait till they hold a race in West Virginia, then we're just going to explode.
Yep, exactly. This is something that I love, that we have this postscript that we are able to talk about this, and then in years in the future we'll be able to come back and be like, yeah, talk about that 2024 Indy 500 as being one for the ages. So that's it for me, and just about it for the show. Justin, before we go, do you have any final thoughts on October Sky or anything else we talked about today?
No, I can't. Unfortunately, October Sky is not available for streaming right now. I had to rent it on Amazon Video, so I guess in a way pay Jeff Bezos money to build his next rocket. So that's how I'm gonna justify that $3 purchase for me to rent the movie for 48 hours. But no, I just if you've never seen the movie, please sit down and watch it. I think you're in for a gem. I think you're going to enjoy it a lot.
Here. I agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment. It's a great film. Definitely check it out. Right. Well, thanks so much for listening this week, everyone. We had a blast talking about one of our favorite movies, October Sky. If you enjoyed this episode and you're enjoying this podcast, consider showing your support by rating and reviewing our show on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to share it with your fellow history enthusiasts and fellow public historians as well. And if you haven't yet subscribed, now's the perfect time to join our community. We'll be back next week with some more engaging explorations into the past. And until next time, this is Jake and Justin signing off. We'll see you next time.